That's beautiful.
I might add one about that is that if he hadn't been so smart, he would have been better loved. And what I mean by that is that when people know that you can't win an argument, because you just can't win an argument, then you start to level insults. And there are certain figures along the way. In the United States, we had the late Cardinal Francis George, and no one could win an argument. Some people are just more brilliant than everybody else around them, and Joseph Ratzinger was that his whole life long. And part of that frustration is that, well, if I can't win an argument, I can attack the man's motives. And he would know that the worst of all arguments is the ad hominem argument, and he spent a good part of his life dealing with that.
Matthew, how would you describe
Well,
him?
in addition to the love of cats and Fanta, we also have to add Christmas cookies. He had a great passion for Christmas cookies and Mozart.
That I can agree with.
There you go.
No one can argue with
that. But you're right. He was always the smartest person in the room, regardless of the room he was in. And the other aspect, though, is for him, there was, because of his genius, because of the depth of his learning, and also, I would argue, his prayer life, he was also a profoundly prophetic figure. If we go back to the 60s into the 70s, his warnings about where we were headed, all of it has come true. You can go back to almost any of his writings where he was talking about the loss of an authentic sense of freedom, truth, and love.
And I want to direct our viewers' attention to St. Peter's Square, where they are now bringing out the body of Pope Benedict XVI. We'll be right back to that shortly. And I just also, it's important to note that Pope Benedict's remains will line the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica in the same tomb where St. John Paul II was initially buried. What's the significance to that?
Well, that tomb, we have one of the experts here, but that tomb was actually used by St. John the 23rd before. In our tradition, no one can be buried in a church until they're beatified. So they're below and then they come up above. And here we see the coffin emerging. And Father Lange will take us through the dynamics of the crypt under St. Peter's.
So St. Peter's tomb is right underneath the main altar of the level. There, some of the first popes were buried right around him. The Book of the Popes, written in the 530s, describes that. And then many of the modern popes are buried in that lower level of St. Peter's, which was the original level of the basilica, built by Constantine in the 320s, that existed all the way up until it was dismantled in 1506 for the present basilica that we have. And so buried very close to him will be now Blessed John Paul I, St. Christina of Sweden, Pope Innocent the Third is buried right down there. St. Paul VI is going to be buried right next to him. I think there's great fittingness to the fact that he's going to be placed in the tomb of where once lay the Pope who convened the Second Vatican Council, St. John the 23rd. He was a great Peritus at the Second Vatican Council. Then of the one who summoned him from Munich, Freising, here to the Vatican to work at his side, St. John Paul II. And we can pray here, as I will, that just as John the 23rd and St. John Paul II were eventually elevated into the upper basilica after their beatifications, that the same thing will happen to the one born to Martin Ill, April 16th, 1927.
We could hear some light applause in St. Peter's Square as they brought out Pope Benedict's body.
And the body's lying there now, and we remember that scene, don't we, from the funeral of St. John Paul II. And it's traditional that the Book of the Gospels, which is placed over a bishop's head when he's ordained, is then placed on a cardinal's tomb, or a cardinal's cassock. And on the right-hand side there, you see his longtime secretary, that's Archbishop Georg Ganswein, who has put the Book of the Gospels there.
And if I'm not mistaken, that was also Bishop Guido Marini, his longtime.
Bishop Marini's successor as Master of Ceremonies was opposite Archbishop Ganswein.
Yes.
And the faithful will be praying the rosary leading up to the funeral mass, which again will be presided over by Pope Francis. Something else that we know today, a peal of church bells will ring across Germany in mourning for Pope Benedict today. The bells of all Catholic churches of the 27 dioceses in Germany are expected to toll at 11 a.m. The White House will be represented by its ambassador to the Holy See, Joseph Donnelly. There are only two official state delegations, those of Italy and of Germany, who will be attending the funeral. It will be a papal funeral mass, maybe more simple compared to others.
The big difference is that because Pope Benedict is retired, he's not a head of state who's died. When his predecessors died, they were heads of state, so there's a kind of a protocol about other state delegations. And of course, you had that astonishing scene 17 years ago, whereas the largest gathering of heads of state in the history of the world, I think it was like over 150 delegations came for that. But that's the difference this time. But obviously, he's a German, and this is his adopted country, so those countries are represented.
Something that should be noted, obviously, Pope Benedict has been Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI in the nearly 10 years of his retirement. But now throughout history, he will be Pope Benedict XVI.
That's right. Going forward, he will be remembered simply as Pope Benedict. But one thing, too, is that what we were just talking about, we have diplomatic delegations not in the same scale that we would for a normal papal funeral. It's just a slight reminder again of how different this funeral mass is.
Yes, absolutely. Again, obviously he was the first pope in nearly 600 years to resign from the papal office. I'd like to just kind of hear our reflections on that. Yesterday, Patrick Kelly, the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus, was remarking about how that was really a sign of his humility, which is a word that's been coming up over and over again in describing Pope Benedict.
I had the chance yesterday to write an article for the National Catholic Register, which is up on ncregister.org now.